I don't know about you, but I usually buy my bottles of wine based on the labels, as well as if it's under $10. But in the exclusive world of fine wine, where even a single bottle can fetch hundreds of thousands of dollars, one man stood out as a master of the industry. I clearly was not his target market. With his impeccable palate and unrivaled collection, Rudy Kurniawan was celebrated and admired by connoisseurs and collectors alike. But as his fame and fortune grew, so did the whispers of doubt and suspicion. Behind closed doors, Rudy was weaving a web of deception and forgery, one that would ultimately shake the very foundations of the wine world. Like, honestly, who cares? But that's all right. Today, we'll dive corkscrew first into the story of how one man became the mastermind behind probably the most infamous wine caper in history. Welcome to Capers and Cocktails, a true crime podcast that doesn't take itself too seriously and gives you something to enjoy while you listen. The following content may be disturbing to some. Discretion is advised. If you're enjoying one of our themed cocktails, ensure you're of legal drinking age and have fun, but drink responsibly. Rudy Kurniawan was born on October 10th, 1976 in Jakarta, Indonesia. According to Rudy, I guess, Kurniawan was actually an Indonesian last name that his father had given him to protect his identity, as the family was living in Indonesia but was ethnically Chinese. Indonesia's capital city of Jakarta is always buzzing with activity, and it's easy to see why. It has vibrant culture, a diverse population, and it's a pretty important city as the center of the country's economy and government. It represents the heart of Indonesia. The cityscape is a dynamic blend of modern high-rises, historic sites, and expansive residential areas, mirroring the rapid development and obstacles that come with being one of the biggest cities in Southeast Asia. Rudy grew up in a wealthy family, we think, and was exposed to luxury and fine things from a young age. Some people have said that Rudy's father owned the entire Heineken distribution for China, but no one in the family has ever confirmed or denied that. I think it's probably not true, as it turns out. Spoiler alert. Regardless, Rudy's family fit into the more upper end of what Jakarta had to offer. He most likely grew up in a moderately wealthy family and was exposed to luxury and fine things from a young age. His family was involved in business, and Rudy himself later moved to the United States, settling in California. He came initially on a student visa in around 1998, and he attended California State University in Northridge. In 2001, Rudy attempted to obtain political asylum in the United States, but was rejected. All of his appeals were exhausted by 2003. In an effort to deport him, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement convinced a court to order Rudy to leave the country voluntarily by April 25th, 2003. However, he decided not to do that. He decided to stay in the United States illegally. The entire time he remained in the States, there was a warrant out for his arrest. This apparently didn't stop him from getting a California liquor license twice. More on that later. Pretty soon, after deciding just to hang around the U.S., Rudy decided to jump into the wine trade. If you didn't know, the world of rare wine trading may be small, but there are huge profits to be made. Some bottles of wine can be sold for hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, one bottle, depending on their scarcity, age, and origin. Wine enthusiasts and investors often seek out coveted bottles from prestigious vineyards, particularly those in renowned regions like Bordeaux, Burgundy, and Napa Valley. Auction houses, private dealers, and wine fairs are the main channels for those transactions, with headlines regularly made when a rare bottle fetches a ridiculous price at auction. It's like art, but you can drink it. And that's art I can get behind. So let's make a wine cocktail. If you're in the United States, mixing anything with wine is pretty scoffed at, but it's a common practice in Spain these days. The Kalimotxo originated in the Basque region of Spain in the 1970s. At first, they used it to kind of hide low-quality wine by mixing it with soda to mask the taste, specifically cola. By low quality, I assume they mean the only kind of wine I actually drink. So, over time, the Kalimotxo became a beloved choice in Spain, actually, particularly at just regular parties and casual gatherings. If you check out the description box, you'll get the recipe to make your own. Also have the mocktail version. While you're down there, share this episode with a friend who also likes to drink cheap wine and pretend it's expensive. Cheers! So Rudy, with his eyes full of dollar signs, decided to jump into the wine selling business. He learned the intricacies of different vintages, vineyards, and production methods. He became a wine expert. He had such a refined palate that he could tell you what a wine was by just drinking it, potentially ruining my hypothesis that basically all wines taste the same. Yeah. But I guess I'm no Rudy Kurniawan, who some said had the nose of a bloodhound. So once Rudy became an expert, he was ready to buy and to sell. He started out small, expensive but not expensive wines. California Merlots, stuff you can buy with daddy's Indonesian money, But somehow things started escalating a bit. And by 2006, Rudy was spending up to $1 million a month on auction lots. He was, in a sense, cornering the market and driving up prices. Some have even called it the Rudy era because of how much he was driving up those prices, particularly on the type of wine he started to covet the most, Burgundy. Burgundy wines, from the Burgundy region in France, are known for their smooth, complex flavors. The region's unique mix of soil and climate creates wines that collectors and wine lovers can't get enough of. And Rudy was buying basically all of it. Okay, now we have to take a quick break from Rudy and talk about a group called the Angry Men. The Angry Men is a wine club associated with the world of rare wine collecting and is known for its high-profile members, including wealthy collectors, wine enthusiasts, and influential figures in the wine auction scene. I know it sounds boring, but we're talking like one of the Koch brothers, high profile. Evidently, the name of the group comes from the idea that you get invited to a wine party and you bring a nice bottle of wine and everyone else around you brings a trash bottle of wine and then you get angry. And they didn't want to be angry anymore, so they just made a club called the Angry Men, and you only hang out with these other angry men and then you just bring nice wine with all the other rich wine dudes. They're very clever. These guys, they're clever. Anyway, Rudy, though not an angry man himself, often did host angry men wine parties at his magic cellar. With his Hermes suit and Patek Philippe watch, Rudy looked the part. He was known to bust out $200,000 worth of wine in one evening. What do these people not have better things to spend their money on? Oh, I guess they don't. They don't. He hosted wine tastings for a lot of collectors, quickly gaining a reputation for his good taste. His favorite Burgundy was Domaine de la Romane Conti, earning him the nickname Dr. Conti. People started calling him the owner of, quote, arguably the greatest cellar on earth, end quote. He started calling his own cellar the Magic Cellar. And people, especially people that had been to his wine parties, like the Angry Men, wanted to buy things from Rudy's Magic Cellar, that's for sure. Remember, he had basically all of the Burgundies that anyone wanted at this point. Buy low and sell high, am I right? So Rudy started selling. Things really took off when he sold wine to two major auctions at Acker, Merrill, and Condit in 2006, bringing in $10.6 million in the first and a whopping $24.7 million in the second. That second sale set a record for the most expensive wine auction at the time. He offered up 8 magnums of 1947 Chateau Lafleur. Rudy was officially in the wine business, and he had the money to show for it. In 2007, Rudy hosted a spectacularly lavish 60th birthday party for his mother at Melis, an upscale restaurant in Santa Monica. He rented out the entire place and provided wines from his magical cellar. Among the attendees was actor Jackie Chan, who at one point climbed onto a chair, holding a glass of Chateau Petrus and declaring, quote, "Rudy, you are the best," end quote. Many collectors in attendance seemed to share the sentiment. He quickly became quite a cult figure, and partially because he was different from a lot of others in the industry. His friend, movie producer Arthur Sarkisian, would say, quote, "He was very warm to everyone. I really liked the guy. The people in this town are full of shit, but not with Rudy. Nothing he did was short of real class, warmth, and graciousness," end quote. Rudy lived with his mom in Arcadia, California, and sometimes brought her to tastings. She was older and didn't speak English, and it was clear that he cared for her. The mythology of Rudy held that he had $1 million a month wine allowance from his dad's Chinese beer money. And someone with $1 million a month for wine doesn't exactly need to work. Rudy chose to live a lavish lifestyle without no responsibilities. I mean, I'd do the same. He was known to sleep in until the afternoon and was disorganized, often showing up late for events and not even paying his own bills on time. He had a tendency to doze off at tastings, sometimes for 20 or 30 minutes before waking up and continuing to drink. That might be the sign of a problem. Who am I to say? Regardless of his quirks, his wines continued to sell like hotcakes, or like expensive wine to people with more money than they know what to do with. It wasn't long, though, before cracks started to show. In 2007, Christie's pulled a lot of 1982 Chateau Le Pin from auction after the winery confirmed the bottles were fake. Then, at a wine conference in Napa, it was revealed that Rudy's 1947 Lafleur bottles were definitely fakes. Only 5 of those magnums had ever been made. On April 25, 2008, the wine auction house Acker Maryland Condit hosted an event at Cru, a restaurant in New York City. At the beginning of the auction, a man named Laurent Ponceau arrived at the restaurant where it was being held. As the owner of Domaine Ponceau, he had traveled from Burgundy to stop the sale of 97 bottles bearing his family's name because he believed they were counterfeit. Among those were 38 bottles of Clos Saint-Denis that the label claimed were made in 1929, while that particular wine wasn't even produced by the winery until the 1980s. Whoops. Sensing something was amiss, Ponceau had called the auctioneer the day before, but also decided to just go ahead and hop on a plane for the auction itself. When the suspected counterfeit ones came up for auction, Ponceau stood up and said, quote, "Withdraw my wines," end quote. A sweaty, nervous auctioneer went ahead and announced to the crowd that all of the Ponceau bottles had been removed from the auction due to inconsistencies. When questioned by a wine magazine after the auction, Rudy replied, quote, "We try our best to get it right, but it's Burgundy, and sometimes shit happens," end quote. Okay. But for Laurent Ponceau, this was personal. He saw it as an attack on his family's legacy and set out to uncover the source of those fraudulent bottles. The day after the auction at Cru, Ponceau had lunch with Rudy and asked him where he had gotten those counterfeit wines. Rudy simply gave a shrug. He traded millions of dollars worth of wine in recent years, and he couldn't remember every single transaction off the top of his head. Rudy, however, promised to check his records when he returned to Los Angeles. Ponceau left the lunch with doubts about whether Rudy had knowingly sold fake wine or if he was a victim himself. In other words, was he the one being deceived, or was he the one doing the deceiving? For a month and a half, Ponceau just pestered Rudy by email to get the name of the seller. And when Rudy finally sent him the name and 2 phone numbers, one of those phone numbers ended up being to an airline and the other to a strip mall. Neither one of those seemed to be wine collectors, as it turns out. Meanwhile, billionaire Bill Koch, one of the angry men, was doing his own investigation. When you're as rich as one of the Koch brothers, you can afford the experts that will look at everything from the glass to the glue, and Bill did just that, and he discovered that Rudy had sold him fakes. Billionaire Bill sued Rudy in 2009 for knowingly selling him counterfeit wines. In 2012, more fakes showed up at auctions in London. At this point, it was clear. Rudy had been selling some seriously shady wine. On the morning of March 8th, 2012, the FBI raided Rudy's house in Arcadia and arrested him. During the search, agents discovered bottles of wine in sinks filled with water, soaking so the labels could be removed. They found a cork extraction device and a recorking device. The man had a mixing station of California wines in his kitchen. He had formulas, basically. He had notes with how he would change the labels, and there were just thousands of old labels. They kept the house at 63 degrees. Special Agent Adam Roser would say, quote, "Essentially, the entire house was a fake wine-making laboratory," end quote. The next day, Rudy was indicted on several counts of mail and wire fraud in New York. As they investigated, they figured out what Rudy was doing in all those fancy wine parties, where he was pouring out the real wines from the fancy expensive bottles. Well, he was saving those bottles and recycling them. He was using whatever was left in the bottle of the expensive wine and filling the rest of the bottles he collected with blends that he made from lesser wines. He was also getting other empty bottles, filling them with his blends, and straight up forging the labels himself. At least in one case, he misspelled the address of a vintner, typing Sackville instead of Sackville. Whoops. Receipts showed he was buying large quantities of wax and empty bottles. He was literally requesting bottles from restaurants around town and asking them not to wash them. At least one of Rudy's friends doesn't think Rudy did it. One of his angry men friends, Hollywood producer Jeff Levy, would say, quote, "He is the last person I would ever suspect of being able to do any kind of intensive arts and crafts. He is ADD. He doesn't have the attention span. It's a time-consuming, laborious thing to do, and he could never do that. I just could not see him doing it, and I still don't see him doing it, and I still don't believe he did it. No way." End quote. Another friend, Jeff Smith, a celebrated wine consultant, would say, quote, "Rudy was not industrious enough to pull this off by himself." End quote. I think maybe Rudy's Kitchen disagrees with y'all, unfortunately. You might have to stay angry there. Rudy's indictment was updated on April 8, 2013, adding new fraud charges, including selling a faked bottle of 1945 Chateau Mouton Rothschild for $48,259 in 2006, and 6 bottles of Domaine Georges Rumière Bon Marais 1923 at a 2006 auction for $95,000. The 1923 bottles were fake, as Domaine Georges Rumière didn't produce wine before 1924. His trial began on December 9th, 2013, where federal prosecutors called him, quote, "the biggest and most successful wine counterfeiter in the world," end quote. In a letter to the court, billionaire Bill would write, quote, "I've spent more than $2 million on these worthless counterfeit bottles and millions more uncovering Mr. Kurniawan's widespread fraud," end quote. Even his name, according to prosecutors, was not given to him by his father, but fake. Rudy Kurniawan is 2 different famous Indonesian badminton players, and his real name was Zhen Wang Huang. No one knew for sure the actual source of his initial wealth, but prosecutors did not think it was Heineken money, but that it might have been his maternal uncles who were involved in the largest bank heist in Jakarta history. I guess heists and conning runs in the family. Just 9 days after Rudy's trial started on December 18th, 9 days, the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison on August 7th, 2014. Rudy's was the first case of wine fraud to be successfully prosecuted in the U.S. Rudy was incarcerated at the C.I. Reeves Correctional Facility in Texas, where he remained until his release on November 7th, 2020. After his release, he was immediately handed over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement for deportation, as remember, he had been living in the U.S. without papers since 2003. His victim, billionaire Bill, who had sued Rudy for counterfeit bottles, saw partial restitution. Some of Rudy's authentic wines were sold for $1.5 million to help repay the victims. Now 51, Rudy is reportedly using his counterfeiting skills as a party trick in Singapore, creating fake wines to be compared to the real deal at exclusive dinners. The dinners are hosted by billionaires who bring out some of the rarest wines from their cellars, with Rudy creating his own version of those wines for a blind taste test. Which one's worth $1 million? Which one's worth $10? Wine fraud expert Maureen Downey, who investigated Rudy's newest business venture, would say, quote, "The overall impression is that people prefer Rudy's wines because they're fresher. That really speaks to the audience," end quote. Evidently, according to his buddy Jeff Smith, quote, "he's an outlaw celebrity in the wine world," end quote. It is estimated that there may be as many as 10,000 of Rudy's bottles still in private collections. Thanks for hanging out with me. If I learned anything from this episode, it's that the wine industry itself is a fraud. My $10 wine probably does taste the same as Rudy's counterfeits, which probably taste the same as those $1 million bottles. I'm just saying, I literally cannot tell the difference between a box and a bottle, and I feel like maybe I'm not the only one. Also, do these rich people drink their $10,000 bottles of wine, or do they just put them in a cellar for another 40 years? The whole thing just seems ridiculous. Oh, but if you want to learn more about the ridiculousness, one of the major sources for today's episode was an Amazon Prime documentary called Sour Grapes. It's a good one if you, like me, enjoy capers about people fooling other rich people into losing some of their wealth for something as stupid as wine. You know I do. Next week, a short one about some guys who made a big mistake about what it takes to disguise yourself for a crime. I'll see you next week. And remember, there's always alternatives to pretending your cheap wine is expensive wine and selling it to rich people, but only because you might get caught.